down the country. It was then regional and tiers. And did we feel like we were standing alone? Definitely, very much so. It just felt that we were treated in a way that other parts of the country wouldn't be treated. There is no way, there is honestly no way that a borough in Greater London, or I would say in the wider South East, would be treated like Bolton were treated. No way at all.
I'm going to move on to another topic linked to this, which is the debate about Tier 3 restrictions, which occurred in October 2020, shortly after this meeting. And I'm going to summarise your evidence and then ask you a couple of questions, if I may. You described that there was unprecedented engagement between Greater Manchester and the government around this time, around the 7th of October, your wife's anniversary, your anniversary, and over the next few days. And the issue concerned the sticking point concerned financial support, and you raised the concern that there needed to be sufficient financial support. And to summarise quite a complex issue, the sticking point related to the level of financial support. A national lockdown would have 80% of a person's salary, whereas is it right that what was offered in these discussions was less than that 80%?
So my memory of this meeting is very much that it was dominated by financial support, because this was about the tier system in principle, not what they hadn't told us they were about to do within a day or two. But we were really clear at this stage, you can't do this, you can't do a Bolton to everybody. You know, you've got to put in place proper financial support. And to be fair, I think Matt Hancock understood that, and he said he would take it back to the Treasury. I remember him saying that in that meeting. I said, look, I can't support measures without that support. And I said really clearly at that point, you can't tell people working in pubs, bingo halls, betting shops, that they only get 67% of their wages, because that's what was kind of building around at this time, that there would be a kind of a tier 3 package for people whose workplaces were closed. And
what would the answer be to someone saying, well, 67% of someone's wage is sufficient compared to 80%?
Well, these, by definition, are people on the lowest wages. So when everyone else was sitting in their gardens on 80%, why would they get 67%? What would possibly be the justification for that?
Yes.
Other than that they were in the north of England in low-paid jobs. Oh, well, you know, that's how it felt to us, and that's why this is the issue about the Tier 3 debate. It became a point of principle about this. They tried to portray that we were quibbling about 75 million or 65. It wasn't. We were saying you've got to put enough money in the system to give people on very low wages that at least an 80% furlough scheme.
I'm going to return to that in a moment. But
except we are coming to that in a later module, Mr. Keating.
Yes. Yes.
Have we had enough for this module?
Nearly. We're nearly there, my lady. I'm going to trespass on your patience just for a moment. In relation to this, and this is going to the points to assist my lady, and is in relation to whether a tier system was going to work. And actually, in relation to that, isn't it right that you had a meeting on the 14th of October with Jonathan Van Tam?
%67 furlough, that there would be definite damage to people's lives and people's businesses. So in meetings, and particularly with Jonathan Van Tam, myself and the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester said, give us, if we're going to do this, you have to guarantee to us that this is actually going to work and it's going to bring the cases down, the R number down below 1.
And the response?
That he couldn't give us that guarantee. Okay. And I think, if I could, this gets to the heart, really, of my evidence and what I wanted to say today.
I'm going to draw that together and give you that opportunity and draw this topic together. And it's right. There wasn't an agreement between you and central government. That's a matter of fact.
We heard the Deputy Chief Medical Officer say, the tier 3 approach wasn't going to necessarily bring our case rate down.
And you're aware that there's been criticism in central government and in wider media of the stance you took, that you were being obstructive and had behaved appallingly. I'm quoting a minute in a meeting. I want to give you the opportunity to be able to respond to that criticism, and then I'm going to move on to another topic.
I've seen that minute, the COVID-0 minute, and frankly, it's nothing short of a disgraceful, the points that were made in that minute. To say, quote back what you just said, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was behaving appallingly. It wasn't me that was behaving appallingly. It was the people in that room that were behaving appallingly, because they were about to impose a policy on Greater Manchester which they knew didn't work. And that's something that I've only now realised looking at other people's statements to this inquiry. And it makes me angry on behalf of the people of Greater Manchester that they sat in that room and they imposed a policy that they had been advised by Sage and others would not work. Indeed, I'm reading Matt Hancock's evidence to this inquiry. I could give you the number if you wish to call it up.
We're going to have the advantage of him giving evidence himself in a few days' time.
So let me just quote from his written evidence. I won't. This is critical for us, because I think the people of Greater Manchester need to hear this and understand this. He says in his evidence about Tier 3, I was in despair that we had announced a policy that we knew would not work.
Did he explain or express that to you around the time of your discussions and negotiations?
No, he didn't.
No.
And I see this conversation in this COVID-0 committee where they then starting to talk about a punishment beating for Greater Manchester, that Lancashire should have a lighter set of measures imposed than Greater Manchester since they had shown willingness to cooperate. Tougher measures should be imposed on Greater Manchester that day, because we stood up for people in our city region who would otherwise have really struggled had they gone into that lockdown without the funds to help them. Because we took that stand, they decided to make an example of us. And it's unbelievable for me now to look at evidence saying they knew it didn't work. They knew Tier 3 didn't work. They knew that, but they were still going to impose it on us without enough financial support.
Mr. Burnham, I'm going to invite you to pause there. I wanted to give you that opportunity. I think you've had a reasonable opportunity to deal with that matter, and I'm going to move on and hopefully have your assistance in relation to another topic. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Communications. And another area I've been invited to explore with you is the wider communications from central government and how they were received on a local level from your perspective, and in relation to certain communities, minority ethnic communities. From your experience, was there issues with the central communication, central government communication, or blanket messaging as you described it?
Yes, I mean, we worked hard to make sure that the core messages from the government were put into languages that could be understood by everybody in Greater Manchester. I think, if I'm being fair, I think there was some collaboration on these matters between public health information experts in Greater Manchester and at the government level, but it was a constant challenge. The absence of British Sign Language interpreter at the daily briefings was unforgivable, to be honest, all the way through.
We've dealt with that in evidence already, but thank you. I'm going to move on really as a final section, and firmly with lessons learned, how to do things better going forward. There may be a couple of topics you might want to raise, but one of them you've touched upon already, and I promised you I would return back to it, would be your view as to the placement of the metro mayors in the civil resilience structure.
Yeah.
I think I said I'd come back to that.
Yes.
That's something you wanted to deal with.
Yes, I just think it's what should be there in a situation like this. Here's my central argument. A more devolved approach to the pandemic would have been a safer approach to the pandemic. The way we run this country is often concentrating power in a very small number of hands in Downing Street and in the middle of Whitehall. It's dysfunctional in normal times. I would say it's dangerous to run things like that in a pandemic. You look at countries like Germany that adopted a much more devolved approach to these things.
Just pausing there, in terms of, you had the Hine Review when you were post the swine flu pandemic. Is there any view that you have regarding the principle of subsidiarity in relation to this?
But that was the central call from the Hine Review, which I set up. It said that a future pandemic should be handled in a much more delegated way, devolved way, with much greater subsidiarity. And it would appear that that had not been taken on board. And the thing that I kind of will come back to is it just because the absence of those structures just meant that people, whenever I spoke to them in Downing Street or Whitehall, they just didn't seem to know how people were feeling in our part of the world. It had been miserable, really, all through 2020, with almost endless restrictions. But they just didn't seem to know. If I could just inform the committee on the kind of final day when we were about to have Tier 3 imposed on the 20th of October 2020, I had a final call with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson. And he was saying, we just need you to agree to these Tier 3 restrictions and the package of support. And I said, well, we can't, it's not enough. You know, we've been under restrictions for a long time. He said, what do you mean? I said, we've been under restrictions since July. You do know about that, don't you?
And what was the response?
And to me, it didn't seem that he did know about that. He wasn't aware that we'd been struggling all of that time. And I think it's the absence of a kind of place every week where people can report in to say, this is how it feels for us at this moment in time. That, I think, led to a situation where there just wasn't an understanding of what some of the things the government was doing, what they were actually, the impact they were having on people's lives. And that's why I hope this inquiry will make some clear recommendations about a more devolved infrastructure that can then both be represented at a national UK level, but then be given more responsibility to deal with the pandemic at a regional and local level.
Mr. Burnham, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Questions. My lady, I think you've granted permission for questions from one of the core participants.
I have, Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burnham, as I think you know, I represent the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And you've known of that group since it formed because you were in fact one of the first public figures to support the call for this public inquiry.
Yes.
I've got permission just for two short points picking up on the matters you've just been asked about. I'm just going to ask you about the period in the middle of September and then briefly the middle of October. On the 16th of September, you wrote a letter to Mr. Hancock, which I'll put up just to remind you of it. It's 165174. Now, I'm not going to read through that, but it's a letter from you to Mr. Hancock, Secretary of State for Health, setting out a whole raft of proposals for escalation measures to be implemented, quite sophisticated measures to be implemented in Greater Manchester in response to the rising cases across the 10 council areas, including support for self-isolation, local food support, services for vulnerable groups, vulnerable people, a call for some changes to local enforcement powers to target enforcement better, and localised enhancement of test, trace and isolate that you've already mentioned. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we can just flick onto the next page.
I think this is what I was saying a moment ago. This is what a more devolved approach to the pandemic, in our view, would have looked like.
The reason I wanted it to put up is so that we can all see, the inquiry can see, the level of sophistication and thought that Greater Manchester have put into this. But the second series of bullet points on the second page is then refer to the other side of the coin, which is what you needed from government. And that included additional funding to help the self-isolation proposals. You needed some legislative changes to support targeted approach to enforcement, and realistic levels of funding to enable local and time-limited interventions, as you've said. So again, sophisticated set of proposals from your side, and then a list of asks, and of course the perennial need for resources to support that. Is that right?
Yes.
So we can take that down, please, and just briefly put up 165173. So the next day, Mr. Hancock responds in a series of WhatsApp messages with you. And I think this rather evidences what you said earlier about him having a cordial, helpful engagement with you on this level. Is that right?
Yes.
And he's checking with you things which are essentially just needed to be checked over with the letter. And you're making clear at the bottom is that you'd be prepared to do localised curfews. You're concerned about the confusing patchwork of restrictions across the 10 council areas, and a clear sense that they're of limited and diminishing effectiveness. And so you're explaining to Mr. Hancock the purpose of your letter and what you need, and that seems to be going all fine in terms of your communication in detail and his orientation to you. Yep. Now, in terms of the financial support, am I right that this was particularly related to low-paid and vulnerable groups? Because without financial support, then there was no way of ensuring the effectiveness of these measures to reduce the high case level.
Yes, this was a theme that I said before we'd raised all the way through. Greater Manchester has a higher number of people who can't access sick pay, or who don't get paid if they're not
so people on 0 hours, people in the gig economy. You mentioned some self-employed people.
There was a survey by Unison Northwest early in the pandemic that found that 80% of domiciliary care workers in the Northwest said they wouldn't be able to self-isolate if they were asked to do so because they wouldn't be paid. That really brings home, if you can't fix that issue, you can't fix the pandemic.
And you're acutely aware of that as the mayor for the area.
Yeah.
Now, we've looked at the immediate response from Mr. Hancock by the WhatsApps, but did this letter of the 16th of September, did this actually lead to any greater financial resources being provided?
I think there were some modest moves later in 2020, but they were never, there was a scheme to be administered via local authorities, but it never got close to the simplicity of the scheme that myself and the mayor of the Liverpool City region were calling.
So these extra resources, to a large extent, you were not able to implement them because of the lack of resourcing.
They never were, we never.
Okay, second point, and briefly, fast forward a month, but same theme, 19th of October, I just want to put up a note prepared by the Cabinet Office, 104731. And again, I'm not going to go through it, but I just wanted to prompt your memory. So this is a note of a meeting with your council leaders and Mr. Jenrick, Minister of State. And this, I think, was aimed at reaching agreement on Tier 3 and from your side, certainly, a financial support package for Greater Manchester. I just want to look at the headline section that's been highlighted there. The summary, and that's Robert Jenrick himself, he summed up by stating that there seems to be a lot of common ground, though not on financial support measures. And then in the second bullet point, he reaffirmed that a hardship fund was not an option tabled by Her Majesty's government. Later, we don't need to go to it, but later in the document, Ed Lister raised, and it was agreed that time wasn't on anybody's side, given rapidly increasing infection rates. The reference to your request for a hardship fund was again going back to the things we've just discussed, assistance for the self-employed and those who simply couldn't afford to stay off work. So it obviously hadn't been resourced up to that point. Was there any further financial resourcing for these measures from there, or did the government stick to its guns in terms of saying, well, we like your ideas, but we're just not going to pay for it?
No, it stuck to its guns. I mean, what we were calling for was money to top up that 67% furlough, that top-up wages point. That's what that refers to. And the government at that point was saying, no, you can have 65 million, which was the core kind of funding that everyone had been offered. And in fact, although they claimed that they were negotiating with us, that was a formula, actually, that they were applying to everybody in Tier 3. So the next day, we go into the final because this was the 19th of October, the next day, the 20th. The final conversation I had with Robert Jenrick, that was the last person I spoke to before they said we're imposing. Well, he told me that, he said, you've been through the whole thing now, we're going to impose. And I said, well, we've tried to work with you. We don't think what we're saying is unreasonable. So I take it with you imposing, you're imposing what you put on the table, the 65 million. Oh no, there's no guarantee of that.
Yes.
And what happened was there was then I went outside to tell the world that we were having this imposed on us, and we tried to avoid it, and we tried to get the best that we could, and we didn't agree with it. And it was in the middle of that when a Greater Manchester MP, Lucy Powell, sent a text to my political director saying, I'm in a meeting with Hancock. He's telling us about the details of the imposition, and he said that we are going to get 25 million. So not only did they not guarantee that, they tried to then initially say they were going to punish us with this.
Less money.
Yeah, and this is how this whole, at this stage, how this whole thing was handled. It was like classic divide and rule.
Yeah.
And should ministers be doing that in the middle of a national emergency? No, they should not.
I had a third point, but you've already answered it. So thank you, Mr. Burnham.
Thank you.
Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Keating, that completes the questioning,
It is.
Mr. Burnham.
It does, my lady. Thank
Mr.
you. so
Burnham,
much.
thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, I think I'm being encouraged to take a break now. I shall return at 25 past.
Thank you, my lady.
Indeed,
Cecil.
indeed, my lady. May I call Steve Rotherham, please, the Mayor of Liverpool City Region?
Sorry to have kept you waiting.
I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly and sincerely
and truly declare
and truly declare
and affirm that the evidence I shall give
and affirm that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Rotherham. Mr. Rotherham, if you can keep your voice up. We also have a stenographer who is taking a note and effectively preparing a transcript of what you are saying. So if we can take things slowly. If I ask you to slow down, it's my fault, not yours, just to ensure that an accurate note is taken. Again, if I ask you to repeat anything, that may well be why. Similarly, if I ask a question and you're not sure what I'm asking or you need clarification, just say. Okay. So, Mr. Rotherham, thank you again for assisting the inquiry. You've also provided a witness statement. That statement is dated the 17th of August of this year. It runs to some 15 pages. And indeed, at the very outset, what we see is a statement and declaration of truth. And if we turn to page 15, we'd ordinarily see your signature, but of course it's been redacted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Rotherham, your evidence today is concerned with your role as Mayor of the London City Region. Is that correct?
Liverpool City Region, yes.
Indeed. So did I say London? I'm sorry, Liverpool City Region. I've got Sadiq, I've got Mr. Khan's evidence in my mind.
Well, you may not be forgiven for that.
I know. I'm off to a bad start already. Let's hope it can only get better from here. But just dealing then perhaps with your professional background, you were heavily involved in local politics initially as a councillor. From there, you became the Lord Mayor of Liverpool from 2008 to 2009. You then were elected as the Member of Parliament for Liverpool Bolton and occupied that role from 2010 to 2017. And then in 2017, you were the elected Metro Mayor of the Liverpool City Region. And indeed, you were re-elected in 2021.
Correct.
Thank you. So it's fair to say that you've had perhaps a long-standing commitment, but moreover, knowledge of Liverpool and its surrounds. Now, I want to turn now, if I may, to the structure of the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. And that's a consequence of a devolution agreement that was signed with the government back in 2017. And it's composed of 6 local authorities, just to run through them very quickly: Bolton, Knowsley, Liverpool, Sefton, St Helens and the Wirral. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, if I can just take you to paragraph 3 of your witness statement, as is on the screen here, that sets out the powers, effectively, that are conferred upon the Liverpool City, I'm afraid, Regional Authority, and indeed the Mayor. And those are economic development, transport, housing, planning and employment and skills. We've heard a little bit about this already earlier today, but there's one notable exception, isn't there, in relation to the pandemic, and that's health. Is that right?
Indeed.
Indeed. Now, similarly, it's not a Category 1 or Category 2 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act and framework. But separately to that, you are an active member of the Merseyside Resilience Forum. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, we have statutory responsibility for public transport, and obviously that's an important role in regard to the Merseyside Resilience Forum, and therefore we have a seat on that. But as the Metro Mayor of the area, we don't have any codified or statutory responsibilities, believe it or not, because the Civil Contingencies Act is 2004, and that predates the Metro Mayors, which came in 2017.
And we're going to turn to that in due course in relation to the structural relationships and potential deficits as you see them. But just dealing with that resilience forum that oversees effectively the preparedness, response and recovery from a major instance within that region. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And similarly, as a consequence of that, it also has responsibility in relation to financials and financial distribution of money effectively in response to restrictions imposed upon the region, and that was true within the pandemic.
Yeah, both in regard to settlements with the government, but also to passport funding as a conduit to local authorities.
Thank you. If I can now turn, please, to your role as mayor, so your individual role, how would you describe that?
Well, I've seen mayors today give evidence, and it's very similar to what you've already heard. I believe that you need a single voice, and there was never a more opportune time for devolution to work than through a pandemic, where you had a single point of contact and somebody who could liaise both with national government and through regional structures with local government.
Indeed. Indeed, as you set out within your statement, also effectively working in the interests of the Liverpool City region area.
Always in with that at heart.
At the heart of what you do.
Indeed.
With regard to your responsibilities as mayor during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was not a codified set of responsibilities in respect to your mayoral role, was there?
That's correct.
And I think certainly within your statement you set out that there were 3 broad categories within which your responsibilities fell. The first of that was civic leadership and coordination. And how did you see that role?
Well, that was speaking up for our area, but also working with other political partners of all different political persuasions to ensure that those voices were heard at central government. Central government may well be from a different political party than me, but the real important issue was that we both did the right things for the 1.6 million people in the Liverpool City region. And so I was very vocal at times to ensure that our voices were heard over the clamour you can imagine from other areas in the country.
Indeed. You've referred to the 1.6 million. That's residents, isn't it, within the Liverpool City region? Mm-hmm. And that rises to approximately 3 million people, including people working within the region. Is that right?
The functional economic geography is a little bit more than that. We think about 3.2 million.
About 3.2 million. Thank you. The second of those roles and responsibilities is facilitating funding. We've touched on that briefly in terms of the broader structure. But just dealing with that deals with the city region and for the benefit of local residents and businesses.
It does.
So it has 2 sides to it. In that respect, those who live there, but also the business and economic activity within the area and the region.
Yeah, there's money from central government, but also, of course, we have different sources of our own funding, and all of that is to ensure that we get the flexibilities to spend the money the way we believe it should be spent in our city region.
Effectively targeting where you feel it's needed most.
Yes, but some we get passported money. In other words, it's hypothecated to the city region and is ring-fenced for certain issues that we have no flexibilities within.
Of course. And then finally, you describe your third set of responsibilities as sustaining services. And if you can just tell us a little bit about that very briefly.
Public transport's probably the main one, and even throughout the pandemic, of course, public transport never stopped. And so that's why it was important that we had that voice in the Merseyside Resilience Forum. But without having the statutory responsibility to be there, we were all too often reliant on the people who represented the combined authority on that forum to come back and to inform us of things that were happening, plus the goodwill of people like the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Chief Constable at the time, which was Andy Cook.
Thank you. I will be putting public transport to one side. It's fair to say that various accommodations were made by you in your role throughout the pandemic, including free transport for key workers, those sorts of accommodations, and then also, of course, you're trying to deal with the deficit from individuals not utilising public transport during that time and the revenues that would incur. Is that right?
One of the benefits of devolution is that we can take those decisions locally, and we decided that there were charges against key workers and essential workers, and we wanted to ease that burden during the height of the pandemic because they were the only people who were using public transport, and yet we were charging them to use that public transport, so we tried to reduce the burden.
And then if I may just turn to an area another area in which there was no authority, and that relates to the regulations and the COVID legislation. And you played no role within those, developing those.
No role nationally, but not even consulted locally.
I'm going to move to consultation in just one moment in relation to both the Liverpool City region and Westminster. And certainly in relation to that, if I can just take you back to the initial stages then of the pandemic, was there any engagement from central government through the months of January, February and up to the lockdown?
No, and people might remember that actually the people who came to isolate and to go to Arrow Park Hospital from who'd been to Wuhan, they came through many areas and ended up in the Liverpool City region, and we weren't even informed that these people were going to travel through our area or end up in a hospital environment being isolated.
So just before I turn to that that's effectively in early February of 2020, were you aware in January or prior to that of the issues in terms of the pandemic and COVID-19 with respect to the UK in terms of communications from central government?
I believe that was the 31st of January when the quarantine happened, and obviously we were all aware, weren't we, as citizens of the world, that something significant was happening. But at that stage, some people believe that it could be contained and not end up as a pandemic.
And so when individuals were repatriated from Wuhan and sent to Arrow Park on the Wirral, when did you first find out about that?
On the news.
What did you do in response to that? Did you try to make any communication with Westminster?
Well, first of all, we contacted Wirral Council because they were the local authority in which Arrow Park Hospital is located, and they had no notifications in advance, and that seemed to be the way in which things were conducted early on.
And did that continue as we moved through the March period into lockdown? Again, were you consulted at any point, or was information or communication made with you or your team?
No, there was nothing in particular. Obviously, there was back channels and informal conversations about what potentially might happen. But within the combined authority, we would sit around at 5 to 6 waiting for the evening news to see whether there was going to be an announcement at 6 o'clock that we would be locked down, and that happened for week after week. And of course, we all know when the announcement happened, but right up until the day of the announcement by the Prime Minister, there was no conversations at all locally.
So as we were approaching the lockdown and from February onwards, did you begin to make your own preparations?
Well, we did, in as much as that we started to think about what the group of people that we'd need to pull together would look like. And I think in March was our first COVID action group, and that was, MPs, the local police, and all the relevant agencies all coming together so that we had a forum that we could all share information in, outside, of course, the statutory responsibility of the Civil Contingencies Act.
And was that prior to lockdown or post-lockdown?
It was our first meeting was on the 20th, which is the Friday before lockdown. So the planning of that must have been weeks before.
Indeed. In your statement, you describe also engaging with the local NHS, Directors of Public Health, from February effectively onwards. Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the problems that we had is that, again, that was predicated on the goodwill of people who were leading local authority areas for me to have access to their Directors of Public Health and not a statutory responsibility.
Again, going back to that potential lacuna that you identified at the outset.
Absolutely.
Now, as the pandemic progressed and post-lockdown, did things improve to any degree in terms of communications with government?
When are we talking about here? What month?
Effectively post-lockdown,
After the
from that
23rd.
March, April, May period.
Yes, there was some informal communications, but there were no official channels for us to raise any particular issues. And it was much later on that we started to get the access to the secretaries of state and senior ministers in the government that we needed to, so that we could find out the information necessary to put appropriate measures into what was happening locally.
Indeed, we've heard a little bit earlier this afternoon about attempts to engage with Westminster and to attend COBRA. Were you part of those attempts?
Yeah, we believed as a group, it was called the M9 at the time, and there were 9 Metro mayors, and I think it was 4 Tories, 5 Labour, so it was pretty balanced, and we believed that there should be representation from that group at COBRA. We hadn't decided who that might be, but we did believe that our voices should be heard because of the enormity of the population that those 9 people had represented.
And with regard to that M9 group, the group of Metro mayors, did there ever come a point where you were represented essentially by one individual in that way?
No, I don't believe so.
And indeed, you did not attend COBRA, save for one exception, which we'll move to later in the chronology, in October of 2020.
Yes, that's correct.
We've heard evidence earlier that you and Andy Burnham issued joint statements asking government to widen membership to also include mayors from the North West. Did you ever get a response to that?
No, I don't believe we did.
Turning, as we go again through the chronology and into the summer, and looking at engagement, a number of MPIs were as relaxed as coming out of lockdown initially, but then also Eat Out to Help Out was announced. Did you have any advance notice of either those relaxations or the scheme?
We had no notification whatsoever, so that came as a real bolt out the blue.
And so were you finding out as the public found out?
Yeah, on nearly every major announcement, we were watching the telly, and we worked late anyway in our office, so we were staying till stupid hour watching what was happening on the news so that we could then start to formulate our response to that for the next day.
And did that present any challenges for you?
Consistently.
And what challenges were they?
Well, that we were reacting rather than proactively working in engagement with central governments to formulate some of those policies.
Did that cause any difficulties with your constituency base?
Often, especially on messaging, and we desperately needed a single voice and some coherence around that message, and that was often lost because things were quite fluid and changed quite often, and things would flip-flop one way and then a different way at a different occasion. So it was much more difficult to take people with you.
Indeed. We're going to deal with some of those challenges later when it comes to looking at tiers, but were there also any logistical challenges for the authority?
There was. I'll give you an example. Both the Mayor of London, Sadiq, and myself were asking, I think in April, around face coverings, and I wanted the government to introduce this, and I wanted to do it locally. And believe it or not, I would have had to have changed the bylaws locally and get that through the legislative process to do that before we could enforce face coverings. So there were lots of things that happened where if it had to come from central government, that would have alleviated the local problems that we were facing.
We've heard a little bit already this morning about that issue and engagement on that issue. So I'm going to leave that there, but mainly because we've got other points to cover this afternoon. But dealing then, if I may, that's public communications and messaging. I'm going to now come to the tiers, and that takes us somewhat ahead, following Eat Out to Help Out, the summer time, and then effectively moving through September and into October. Now, in October, is it correct that there were rising infection rates in the northwest, and in particular within the Liverpool region?
They were across the northwest, but specifically in the Liverpool City region, and one of our areas was the third highest R rate in Europe.
So you had one of the third highest R rates in Europe. In terms of the situation with regard to the NHS and hospitals, how did that present itself in the Liverpool City region?
Well, by now we were having regular conversations and meetings with the directors of public health, with our NHS representatives and with the scientists. And around mid-October, we were getting genuinely concerned that the NHS didn't have the capacity. If the R rate had continued and the numbers of people were presenting with infections in hospital, then there would have been no capacity at all within the Merseyside area for anybody presenting with any other condition that was non-COVID. So we were literally at capacity and worried that it might tip over.
The inquiry has heard some evidence about the development of the tier structure in response to concerns such as the rising R rate and infection numbers within Liverpool. When did you find out about the potential for tiering?
So we'd had some conversations with the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, early in October, I think it was the 5th. And within that, he'd said there might be the need for some additional restrictions. And I think tiering might have been muted, certainly no detail on that. And what we were very concerned with at that same time was that the government had also floated the idea that furlough would be reduced from 80% to 67%. And so that was the main topic of conversation from my perspective, because I was 100% opposed to any reduction, because that would have hit our area harder than anywhere in the country.
Indeed, and presumably you've been listening to the evidence immediately before you from Andy Burnham in relation to furlough. I'm not going to go back over that now, save us to say you're on the same page as him, presumably.
I didn't hear it all, and the connectivity is not brilliant, so it cut out. But generally, we do speak with one voice, myself and the Mayor of Greater Manchester, because we were communicating on a regular basis, a daily basis, during that terrible period.
In terms of Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 and potential Tier 3 restrictions for the Liverpool City region, when did you first hear about that?
So we had a meeting with the Chief Medical Officer on the 9th of October. I think that was the Friday. And within that, he outlined the concerning situation across the Liverpool City region with the R rate, but with the NHS. And it was understood that something needed to happen specifically in our geography, because we were genuinely concerned that we wouldn't have any additional capacity. So that was the first time that sort of thing had been discussed. He showed us all of the scientific evidence, put charts up on the screen. It was along with all of the leaders in the Liverpool City region, so the 6 local authority council leaders. So we basically knew we had to do something collectively.
And in terms of doing something collectively, at that point, was it envisaged that it would be a tiered system with increasing levels of restrictions, or were you looking at something different?
I think that came on the Saturday. The actual, we need to discuss about this new thing, Tier 3. We started to talk about what that might look like and what those additional restrictions would be, whether it be an a la carte menu or whether it be a prescriptive list of things that we had to do. And of course, then if we did enter into Tier 3, because at that stage nobody had, if we were first entrants, what any financial support package would look like, because obviously that would mean with another local lockdown that businesses would be constrained, and we were very, very adamant that businesses shouldn't be detrimentally impacted.
So were financial considerations a concern for you at that point?
Massive.
Now, in terms of discussion with the government, from the 9th to the 11th of October, spans a weekend in short,
Yeah.
you were involved in a number of discussions, negotiations, is that right, in relation to the measures that would be taken within the region, but also the financial package that would come alongside it?
Yeah, with all sorts of people within Number 10 and secretaries of state and scientists and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, to tell you the truth. But we really wanted to understand the science and whether the list that eventually emerged would do the job, whether that would tackle some of the problems that we'd previously identified.
And just to be clear, those discussions and negotiations involved the Prime Minister, Edward Lister, who we've heard from previously, Robert Jenrick, another Member of Parliament, and other individuals.
Very much around Ed Lister, to tell you the truth. The others were peripheral. Ed Lister was central to this, and he was the one that constantly we had conversations with, and Zoom and Teams calls, and was somebody who would pick up the phone to me during the negotiations and inform me of what the thoughts of the Prime Minister were.
Indeed. And we know from other evidence that he was dealing not only with you, but some of the other areas as well, and other mayors, as we've heard today and indeed earlier in the inquiry.
Yeah.
With regard to those negotiations and the debate, did you reach a consensus or effectively an agreement? And at what point?
Well, we were certainly in dialogue right up until Sunday early evening. And then we sort of had adjourned that, and we were going to pick this up the next day on the Monday the 12th. Yeah. And there was a front page of the Times Online that came out that evening, and that basically identified that it was a fait accompli, and we were going into Tier 3 whether we liked it or not. But we still thought that we were negotiating a deal.
So did that come as a surprise to you, that announcement in terms of the paper article?
Yeah, we were certainly moving towards the same conclusion, but to have the rug pulled under our feet because we were very concerned at the messaging to the people in the Liverpool City region. At this same time, we had Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, who was trying to push back against the government, who had not supported Greater Manchester for weeks and weeks and weeks when they'd been in the highest tier. And so for that to be seen that Manchester were opposing something, but we were almost voluntarily, as people would have seen it, moving into the highest tier, I thought could be problematic. And certainly that's how it panned out.
Indeed. I'm going to move to that at a moment. Just want to deal with the remainder of the 12th of October first, if I may. You attended, that's when you attended the first and only COBR meeting, is that right? And if I can just call that up, please. Thank you. And here we see the minutes of that. You can see that it was held on Monday the 12th of October at 10:30 in the morning. A large number of attendees, the Prime Minister sitting in the chair of the meeting, if you can go over the page. See further attendees are present, and over again. It's a very long list, I'm afraid, and you're on, I think, this page. I can see you on the right-hand side, third up from the bottom, as attending. With regard to that, if I can go to page 5, please, and paragraph 1 of that. Initially, it opens with the Prime Minister welcoming everybody and thanking you for being in attendance that day. Gives an update on the situation. The R rate was between 1.2 and 1.5 and pinpointed various areas where transmission was of particular concern. Nottingham, London, Derry. Said a full lockdown would interrupt education again, would be very economically damaging. Alternate option, letting disease spread would result in many thousands dying prematurely, A middle ground course of action led locally was required to reduce transmissions of COVID-19, and its success critically dependent upon the cooperation of the public. And here we see the Chair, the Prime Minister, acknowledged a package of support developed by Merseyside to reduce infections within Liverpool. So that's the opening, in short, to the meeting. Is that right? That's the context.
Yeah, and the most important line in all that is that it says its success was critically dependent upon the cooperation of the public. I think that needs to be borne in mind for what we come on to.
Public messaging.
Indeed.
Indeed. If I just continue onwards, please, to paragraph 2, we see an update from the Chief Medical Officer, and this is specific to your area, effectively. He said the rates of COVID-19 amongst the over 60-year-olds, particularly within Merseyside, were going up, resulting in increased hospitalisations and deaths. COVID-19 was displacing other health conditions, which was increasing the burden of disease among non-COVID-19 conditions, a theme that we've already heard evidence on. Continues, and this is the Chief Medical Officer's view, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, concluded implementing baseline Tier 3 restrictions would not reduce the R rate to below 1, and compliance with more stringent measures would be required to successfully reduce the virus. It then continues through the meeting, come back to some scientific advice momentarily, and we go through to your update. It's on page 6, please. It's paragraph 9. You've been asked for your views on the potential measures in terms of local measures. It says the overall goal was to reduce the infection rates, relieve pressure upon hospital beds, that's what we were just referring to earlier. Measures to reduce infection included improved local capacity to use test and trace data. Enforcement remains a challenge for local authorities. Simplified legislation would support that. Concluded that hospitality would be impacted greatly by the new measures, asked that further consideration was given to how to support those workers. Did you go into detail in relation to any further support within this meeting from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I said that it was an absolute red line for us to still at that late stage enter into any deal with national government that would see a reduction of furlough from 80% to 67%, and I think that's what that's referring to, slightly coded, but it was the people, the workers in the city region who we were trying to protect at this stage, and of course it also mentions test and trace data. That was something that we'd longed for, and I think this is the bit that I did hear Andy was explaining. It wasn't until I think it was Nadine Zahawi was appointed that we started to get access to some of that data, but that data should have been ours as a right.
Indeed. Just continuing, if I may, just to focus on this meeting at the present time. You've raised the issues of furlough, you've raised the issue of the financial package. At this point, there had been no deal, had there? It was still being negotiated.
Nothing absolutely concluded, but we were very much moving towards that. And just so that we have a full picture of this, there are people who spoke later, and the leaders, Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford, and Arlene spoke later, Foster, and they all said that they'd supported my red line, which was no reduction in furlough. Now, moving on through and just dealing with the other advice that was provided in relation to the tier system with which you were considering and why you were there that day. If I can go to page 8, please, and paragraph 18. What we have here is the government's chief scientific advisor, so Professor Sir Patrick Vallance. I'm explaining that the impact of lockdowns and the impact of doing nothing were known. The impact of interventions between them was not known. And it continues, however, while the granularity of effects were not yet known, it was clear a baseline Tier 3 approach would not reduce the R rate to an acceptable level. A circuit breaker approach, a hard period of intervention for a limited time period such as 3 weeks, was an option that SAGE had considered. It could reduce the R rate to below 1 and would allow for a period of reduced infections to follow. He concluded another positive of circuit breakers was that they could be planned for, but that final decisions would be dependent upon strategic aims. Were circuit breakers discussed at this meeting that you were present at of COBR? not just at this meeting, but it was something that the Metro mayors had called for some considerable time in the build-up to all of this, because we understood that whilst we had to do stuff to control things within our own geography, there's a bleed between geographies. People don't stick rigidly to those administrative boundaries. So within the curtilage of the Liverpool City region, every single day people flow in and out of it. And we knew that it was much more difficult to do it in one area, but we had to try something. And by the way, what we did was demonstrably successful, because despite, that's a generalised statement, isn't it? But within the Liverpool City region, we did see a fall over those 3 weeks, even with a Tier 3 approach.
Of course, it was then Tier 3 then moved into the national lockdown.
Exactly the point, yeah.
At
But
the
we'd
end.
already started to go in the right
But
direction.
infections had started to decrease.
Yes.
Now, at that point, was your view that Liverpool City region ought to enter into a tier system, or that there ought to be a circuit breaker?
I think it was an inevitability that we were going to go into Tier 3, given the Times headline. What I was most concerned about was the messaging. And I pointed out earlier, if you don't take the public with you, it doesn't matter what those restrictions might have looked like and the arguments for or against it. It had to be communicated correctly to the people in the Liverpool City region, and I wasn't afforded that opportunity.
And just going to that and not being afforded that opportunity, after this COBRA agreement was reached and finalised, and at that point, is it right that you had a phone call with the Prime Minister?
Yeah.
And what was discussed in that phone call with the Prime Minister?
Well, exactly the whole scenario about how we would communicate to ensure that there was compliance as widely as possible. And I very much emphasised the fact that a Tory Prime Minister in an area like the Liverpool City region might not be the best person to be communicating this. And so therefore there should be a joint comms strategy on this, and we needed to get the messaging absolutely nailed down, and he agreed to that. So I had my team ready and was expecting a phone call from number 10's team so that we could agree some wording on what that would look like, but unfortunately that wasn't the case.
Indeed, later that afternoon, it was announced by the Prime Minister that Liverpool City region was entering Tier 3, is that right? And then subsequently in a number 10 press conference that evening.
On both of those occasions, yeah, without any notification to me, and then we had to try and pick up the pieces.
And what were the consequences of that in terms of implementing Tier 3 within the Liverpool City region?
At this stage, we were the first, as I say, but Manchester, because of their extended restrictions period, were still trying to get a deal. So it looked as if we were doing a deal, but we hadn't had those same restrictions prior to Tier 3. And people didn't understand that outside. It was a confusion of who was saying what, and why would Manchester not accept the deal and we would accept the deal. And as I've explained, for all the right reasons, we wanted to ensure that we could reduce the R rate, but also about the deaths, because as the R rate increased, the death rate did, and we were really cognizant of the fact that far too many people had already succumbed, and we needed to do everything that we possibly could. And what happened was, as soon as the Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons, Twitter literally blew up. My team, who, tried to manage the social media side of things, just said there's thousands, and that resulted in all sorts of threats and unintended consequences, I'm sure.
And when you say threats, do you mean threats to you or to your team?
I think probably to me more than the team, but there were direct threats, and that resulted in the Chief Constable having to post 24-hour security. And I'm not sure that when the Prime Minister broke that agreement with me, that in any way he thought that might have been a consequence. But that's why I was so clear in what we needed to do to prevent those sorts of eventualities.
Now, with regard to public compliance, the Liverpool City region did go into Tier 3 the following day.
Yeah.
On the 13th of October. It remained in Tier 3 up until the national lockdown, the second lockdown, came into force. But initially, it was to last for 4 weeks with a sunset clause. Is that right?
It was, and we got a financial package to support that. But the issue wasn't the 4 weeks. The issue was the additional restrictions, because we agreed the package, and I was told that it was a prescriptive package. And then Lancashire went into Tier 3, and their restrictions were different than ours, and that caused, again, a hiatus and some problems.
Indeed, and within your witness statement, you set out the correspondence that you subsequently have in relation to that package, financial arrangements and so on, mostly outside of the scope of this particular module, but of course the information is there, so I don't propose to take you further through that with regard to that aspect. Just want to touch now, if I may, on one other issue, and that is firstly, in terms of the lobbying, you lobbied the government on various issues, one being access to PPE. You've already mentioned face coverings. A third being financial support that you've touched upon already, and indeed we've heard evidence earlier today, and there will be some questions on that in due course. So I'm not going to deal with that in any great detail now, but simply in relation to potential financial support packages to enable individuals to self-isolate. That was your concern in relation to the test and trace programme, is that right?
This was fundamental, really, to why I believe that the R rate had spiked, because there were far too many people, certainly low-paid jobs in the Liverpool City region, where them people were faced with a sword of Damocles decision, and that was, if they felt that they might have had symptoms, they were choosing whether to stay home and get no pounds, no pence, or to take the chance that they didn't have COVID and go to work. And I think that was an intolerable position to put anybody in. And we explained this time and time again to government that they needed to support us, because we needed to have a package to support those workers, so that if they felt that there may have been COVID symptoms, that they erred on the side of caution and stayed at home.
Indeed. And you launched a Time Out to Help Out campaign, a play on the Eat Out to Help Out campaign in terms of words. Again, you'll be asked some questions about that. The other aspect that I wish to touch on very briefly is one particular event that took place at the outset of the pandemic on the 11th of March. Again, you're going to be asked some questions about that, but it's the Liverpool match, the Champions League match versus Atletico Madrid that took place. The background to that being that public health concerns were growing, as you've explained. And with regard to that time, what you say about that is that it was not clear at this stage if the government was seeking to take a herd immunity approach or was simply waiting until the last minute to implement a national lockdown. And that's in relation to the timing of this particular football match that was being played. Why did you consider herd immunity to be a real possibility at that stage?
Because the government didn't seem to have any strategy to tackling the pandemic, and it appeared that they were just allowing things to happen. Herd immunity, look, I'm not a scientist. I hadn't heard of herd immunity beforehand. This was something that we were reading about and learning about, and I'm worried about. But we do know, don't we, from evidence to this inquiry, that there are allegations against the Prime Minister about piling up the bodies, and that's how it felt out on the front line of this, if you like. You know, it felt as if they were just going to allow it to let rip, and that was a major concern for all of us.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the questions about involvement in decision-making in relation to that match to others. But if I may just ask you finally now, in terms of lessons to be learned for the future and recommendations, a few questions in relation to the structural aspects concerning the role that you played as Mayor. and the devolution agreements and the role of regional authorities essentially within any civil emergencies response. You've already explained that the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority is not a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. We've also heard that London is. To what extent do you consider that lack of status as a Category 1 responder made a difference to your ability to coordinate the regional response in the Liverpool City area?
Massive difference. As I say, I relied on the goodwill of others, including the leaders of local authorities. We were all from the same political persuasion. It might have been more difficult if we had people from different political parties, and therefore the likelihood that people could have played politics. At no stage did any individual leader of the local authorities or the combined authority ever put politics before people. It was always about our place and our people. And we were about protecting lives, but protecting livelihoods as well. And that was the mantra right the way through it. Because we weren't privy to some of the discussions and deliberations at the Merseyside Resilience Forum, it was people anecdotally telling us things that had happened there, and that cannot possibly be the best way that we can run things, and there needs to be a statutory footing for Metro mayors. Basically, our role needs to, the legislation needs to catch up with the advent of what we've now got across the city, across the country with regional mayors.
Of course, that legislation dates back to 2004, devolution agreements subsequent to that, considerably so. And do you consider that that lack of status played any role in the way you were treated by central government with regard to effectively COBR meetings, Westminster, Number 10, Cabinet?
Possibly. I haven't got the evidence to support this, but there was a feeling that because we didn't need to be included, that at times we weren't. And I'm slightly more confident that if we did have that codified statutory responsibility within the Merseyside Resilience Forum, that not only would the information have been readily to hand, but also governments would have had to have included Metro mayors and myself as part of the deliberations around that.
Thank you. I've got no further questions for you at this stage, but if you just pause there, my lady, there are 2 sets.
Mr Weatherby.
Thank you very much. Mr Rotherham, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And just 2 short topics, the first of which is the Atletico Madrid match. And it's of particular importance because a number of the families that I represent believe that their loved ones contracted COVID as a result of that match going ahead. Now, for context, the match took place on the 11th of March, and that was the day that the Director General of the WHO, belatedly some may say, declared COVID to be a pandemic, and in doing so called internationally for urgent and aggressive action to combat its spread. His words, not mine. Yet on that date, the match was allowed to go ahead in Liverpool. And the match was attended by, as you know, more than 50,000 people. The attendance included something like 3,000 people from Madrid. And again, by way of context, at that time, Spain generally already had well-known high case numbers. Madrid was a particular hotspot, and many Spanish football games were already taking place behind closed doors, and there was a partial lockdown there at that time. So in terms of the match going ahead, were you consulted by ministers or government officials in relation to any decision to allow the match to go ahead?
So this was during March and sort of the pre-lockdown period, although of course it happened very quickly afterwards. There was this in the Cheltenham Festival, I think, at the same time. Yeah. And that's when lockdown happened, which was too late for some people. At no stage were we consulted by any body, not just national government, but there was no consultations with ourselves. Quite the opposite, actually. I mean, we were trying to get information, and at that stage, the government said the fixture was low risk.
Right. So, I mean, at that time, you were concerned about it. And was it your view that the match shouldn't go ahead?
Well, I was personally concerned as well, because I'm a Liverpool fan.
Yes.
And I actually went to the game. And I remember it being very different than, I think, nearly every other game that I've been to, because of fan behaviour. You were already seeing people sort of not socially distancing, because you can't at a football match, but being much more cautious. And certainly with goals being scored, which we all know are a moment of unbridled joy, there was certainly a subdued way in which supporters were celebrating.
But, I mean, the concerns that you had, did you think it should have gone ahead at the time or not? Or were you simply looking for guidance from official scientists or government ministers about it?
Well, we had no scientific evidence to support the fact that we were concerned about it. But if the government had said, listen, this is not going ahead, I think everyone would have breathed a sigh of relief. But there was no evidence presented to us that it was anything other than the low risk that the government claimed.
Did you attempt to contact ministers or officials to question that, to say where is the advice?
We had literally no conversations with national government at that stage about concerns over COVID. I mean, the doors were closed.
But did you attempt to do so?
No, not directly, no.
Yeah, okay. Now, following the match later in April, I think it's a matter of public record that in fact, the city mayor, then Joe Anderson, called for an inquiry into why the game had been allowed to go ahead. And I think you supported that call for an inquiry, is that right?
I think if you get the chronology right, I was the first one.
You were
3
first.
days before to say that there needed to be an inquiry into it. What happened was that the Mayor of Liverpool had asked that Matt Ashton, who is the Director of Public Health, look at a local
I see. So you asked for a governmental level inquiry into whether the match should have gone ahead?
Yeah, I had concerns, and I had phone calls from people who were genuinely worried that parents had gone to it, and of course, one or two of those subsequently did succumb to the illness.
Yeah. And did you get any response from government level regarding the rationale for the decision to allow the match to go ahead, or how municipal authorities or anybody else was supposed to manage 3,000 attendees from Madrid? Did you get anything after the match was over, after your call for an inquiry, by way of explanation as to that?
This was, as I say, during the period where the government just blanked anything. I mean, it was a waste of time and energy trying to get them to do or help or assist or advise, because it all fell on deaf ears at this stage, and not just in March, but right the way through until May and beyond.
You called for an inquiry but got nothing back. Now, the second point is very, very quickly, different topic, but about the position later in the summer. Mr. Hancock, in his second statement at paragraph 454, effectively puts the blame on local leaders, or some local leaders, making political points rather than following the data in terms of the problems that you've already been asked about over the summer. How do you react to that? Was it local leaders who should be held accountable for the difficulties in the imposition of these localised regional restrictions, or were there other issues?
There was never an occasion where I was present at any meeting with any political parties or leaders where people tried to play party politics on this. But look, does politics play a part in the background to this, of course it does. You know, when you have local authorities that are being hit the hardest in the whole country, they have a feeling that national government aren't listening to them. Yeah. When you have an NHS that's teetering anyway, they are political decisions, but there wasn't party politics that were in any way a consideration of the approach that we took.
Yeah, and
it was
part
just
of
a
that
backdrop
was,
to everything.
as you said, that nearly half of the mayors, the metropolitan mayors, were in fact Conservatives.
Indeed, and within their combined authority areas, there are a mix of different political persuasions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Wetherby. Ms Peacock.
I have a few short questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. You've already touched upon in your evidence the Time Out to Help Out campaign you launched in August 2020 alongside Mr Burnham. My questions focus on that campaign. That campaign asked central government to continue to pay workers their full wage when they were required to self-isolate and they were unable to work from home. Is that right?
Correct.
How did that campaign envisage, practically speaking, that workers would be paid to self-isolate? What was the proposal?
The proposal was that if anybody felt that they had the symptoms of coronavirus, to err on the side of caution and for them to stay at home, the employer would pay the statutory sick pay to them, the bit between statutory sick pay and what their wage was, but that'd be topped up by the government. So the employer would pay it, but they'd be recompensed by national government.
And in terms of self-employed people, was it envisaged that they could claim for loss of earnings up to a maximum daily amount as they're able to when on jury service? Is that right?
But that's what we thought. We thought, you know, people who have complied with their public duty to do jury service, for instance, that's what we were claiming that people should do with coronavirus. It was about public duty, and it was about those people thinking about what the consequences might have been if they went into work with symptoms and them symptoms had been realised.
And you explained in your evidence earlier that you considered this issue was absolutely fundamental to why the R rate spiked, because people on low incomes were being asked to make that very difficult decision between self-isolating and going to work and receiving payment. How did this issue come to your attention? How did you become aware that this was an important issue for workers and residents in the Liverpool City region?
Well, I think there was an excellent campaign by the unions to highlight the issue, but I was in dialogue with Frances O'Grady at the time, and she'd spoken out that something needed to happen because too many people, both the excluded group, so the people who were self-employed and freelancers, were being left behind, but so were people who didn't qualify because they were on 0 hours contracts, so they were under the threshold.
My final question is, do you consider that central government responded adequately to the Time Out to Help Out campaign and the need for financial support for self-isolation at any point during the pandemic?
I think this, like a number of other issues that we've discussed, was something that not only did they not respond adequately, I don't think they actually responded.
Those are my questions, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Peacock.
Thank you, my lady. That concludes the evidence for today.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Rotherham. Safe journey back to Liverpool. Thank you for your help.
Thank you.
And that completes the evidence for today. 10 o'clock tomorrow? 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All rise.
You have a minute for a quick call, Durham. What was the purpose of this call, Mr. Durham? Were you discussing the impeachment inquiry?
I never had any conversation with Attorney General Barr about the impeachment inquiry.
Mr. Durham, this is an awful lot of direct interactions with the Attorney General for imposed, supposedly independent counsel prosecutor. During these messages that sound to you like appropriate interactions, do they sound like appropriate interactions between an Attorney General and a prosecutor investigating the administration?
Sure. Before I was appointed special counsel, I worked for the Attorney General of the United States. That's who
But you
supervised
subsequently
me.
became special counsel. I know that. You
Right.
subsequently became. Not only did you interact with the Attorney General frequently, you also regularly engaged with one of his top deputies, Seth Ducharme. What was your relationship with Mr. Ducharme?
Seth Ducharme had been an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York. He works with one of my sons, we were friends, and he, at the time, was working in the Office of the Attorney General.
It seems that rather than having an
Time of the gentlelady has
independent
expired.
investigation,
Time
there
of
was
the
a lot of interaction between the
Time of
Attorney
the
General and the
gentlelady
special
has
prosecutor,
expired. Well, I've
which
been-
shows
I've been
that
generous with the time,
the
and we'll
Attorney
continue to
General
do so,
was
but-
actively directing your work. I
Gentlelady
yield
yields,
back.
the gentlelady yields back. I think this is amazing, Mr. Durham. You had 8 text messages with the Attorney General of the United States in an 11-month time period. That's amazing. I can't believe that.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
The,
Whose time is that you were speaking on?
that was that time that was yielded to me earlier that I yielded back, I think.
That's a select.
Mr. Chairman, that is
text. A lot more than that.
absolutely inappropriate.
I was just pointing out something that I think is so
Mr.
so
Chairman, that is
ridiculous.
not appropriate.
And we will go to Mr. Klein for 5 minutes. The gentleman from from Virginia, is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Durham, your report is not just sobering, as you stated. It's outrageous and deeply troubling. Can you confirm these several main points that it found? The FBI did not have an adequate basis on which to launch Crossfire Hurricane, correct?
That's correct.
The FBI failed to examine all available exculpatory evidence, correct?
Correct.
FBI leadership continued the investigation even when case agents were unable to verify the evidence, correct?
That's correct.
The FBI did not interview key witnesses in Crossfire Hurricane, correct?
Correct.
And individuals within the FBI abused their authority under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, correct?
Correct.
The FBI immediately opened Crossfire Hurricane as a full counterintelligence investigation. What other options could the FBI have taken rather than immediately opening such an investigation?
Attorney General Edward Levy essentially created the guidelines in this area, these 3 divisions of assessments, preliminary, and then full, although they were different names at the time. That has evolved over time and become more particular. In this instance, the information that they had received from Papadopoulos about a suggestion of a suggestion, and not anything about emails, but just a suggestion of a suggestion, was sufficient and would have required the FBI to take a look at, well, what is this about? You open it as an assessment, and then you would analytically go try to collect intelligence that either supports or refutes or explains that information. That's the whole purpose of it. You assess it, and then you can move to a preliminary investigation, and if the evidence bears it out, then you go to a full investigation where you have all the tools available, including the most intrusive physical surveillance and electronic surveillance of U.S. citizens. Here, they just immediately went to open it as a full investigation without ever having talked to the Australians or gathered other evidence.
Right, so investigators relied on misstatements by the confidential human source, ignored exculpatory statements made by Papadopoulos in submitting the FISA application to surveil Carter Page, correct?
That's correct.
Is it true that an FBI employee fabricated this evidence? Can you expand on that fabrication and the reliance to support that FISC
Sure.
application?
In connection with one of the extensions, the final extension renewal of the FISA on Carter Page, one of the agents who had come on board wanted to be certain that there was information that was there information as to whether or not Carter Page had been a source of information to the CIA, and pressed Kevin Kleinsmith in the General Counsel's Office of the FBI on that point. Kleinsmith got a hold of people at another government agency, intelligence agency, on the issue, and that person said that yes, in FBI parlance, Carter Page was the source, and put that in writing. When Kleinsmith talked to the agent who was saying, we want to be sure on this, was he or was he not a source? Kleinsmith said, no, he said he's not. He said, did we get that in writing? Kleinsmith said,
exactly sure, but I think I lost the key. Yep, I'm sure. You lost the key? Tommy Pickles! The driver has one job! I guess we're getting heated. Yeah, nice knowing everybody. Get eaten by a dinosaur? Not today! I didn't know we could leave. But guys, Tommy's not good at running yet! Hang on, everybody. This might work.
Let's go, Junior Carpenter!
Hold on to your buttons. Tommy, I think now might be a good time to go faster. Don't worry. It says right here, stuffs in the mirror are furtherer than they appear. Maybe it's that closer. Oh, for Pete's sake! That's why the little kids should leave the reading to the grown-ups. Reptar overboard! Tommy, stop! I'll save you, Reptar! At least you won't get crushed alone. Abandon the hamster ball! Pretty okay. What's safer than a hamster ball? Someday